Hello, my name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group discussion of On Revolution. We are talking today about Chapter 1, The Meaning of Revolution. This is, in many ways, simply Arendt's attempt to say this word revolution is fairly new. There are historical antecedents. We're going to distinguish it from them, and we're going to try and locate the essence of what the word and the idea of revolution is. And her answer, I think, is unsurprising and fairly simple. It's that a revolution is a new beginning, and it is the coincidence of freedom and the foundation of freedom with a new beginning. And so she will write on page 19, quote, "Crucial then to any understanding of revolutions in the modern age is that the idea of freedom and the experience of a new beginning should coincide." And so it's these two fundamental ideas that are going to be with us throughout this book. The experience, the idea of freedom, which he's also going to call the experience of freedom, but the idea of freedom and the experience of a new beginning. So the idea and the experience, the idea of freedom and the experience of a new beginning. She spends the first few pages of the chapter distinguishing modern revolutions from revolutions that came before them. The Greeks had an idea of unalterable constant change. So change was part of the Greek universe, political universe, but was not a revolutionary change, a new beginning. The Romans were marked, and this is something Arendt writes a lot about traditions of feeling and continuity and the carrying over of one tradition over time, and thus, again, not a break. The Christians had an idea of a transcendent new beginning. But again, that was not a new beginning in this world. And then there's the modern revolutions, and often they're thought of as social revolutions, as revolutions for economic equality. And yet Arendt is clear that the American Revolution was not driven by that. She thinks that in the American Revolution it was largely a revolution by people who already saw themselves as socially equal and economically visible, socially visible, having a place in the world. And so the revolution for her doesn't come from social questions. The French Revolution was in large part driven by social questions, and that's one of the distinctions between the French and the American Revolutions that she's going to consider throughout the book. For her, it's not the social question that defines this modern revolution as a new beginning. It's the plot, she says, of modern revolutions, both French and American, is the emergence of freedom. This again on page 19. And so we need to look at these two ideas, the idea of freedom and the experience of a new beginning. And in this first section of chapter 1, she then goes and looks at both of them. And so the idea of freedom, as she says on page 20, is an old idea. And so she cites Herodotus, and she's on page 20. Since Herodotus, freedom is a form of political organization in which the citizens live together under conditions of no rule. This notion of no rule was expressed by the word isonomy. And a little later, the equality of the Greek polis, its isonomy, was an attribute of the polis and not of men, who received their equality by virtue of citizenship, not by virtue of birth. And so, back to the Greeks, the idea of isonomy, a nomos, a rule of each one, iso, is not something that people had simply by being men. It was an attribute of the polis, where people were equal because they were citizens, not because of their birth, but because they were citizens of a polis, and they lived in that polis under conditions of no rule, in the sense that everybody ruled. Not anarchy, not I rule myself, but we all were part of the rule. And this is not democracy. Democracy, she says, actually was a charge by the critics of isonomy, which was sort of the rule of the people is unordered and disordered. It was the worst kind of rule. Isonomy is this idea that we are all not equal in economic conditions or social conditions, but equal in that we all govern together. And this is in her mind the beginning of the idea of freedom. And so she'll write on page 21, the reason for this insistence on the interconnection of freedom and equality in Greek political thought. And just to be clear, it's freedom and political equality. And the reason for this insistence on the interconnection of freedom and equality in Greek political thought was that freedom was understood as being manifest in certain, by no means all, human activities, and that these activities could appear and be real only when others saw them, judged them, remembered them. The life of the free man needed the presence of others. Freedom itself needed, therefore, a place where people could come together, the agora, the marketplace, or the polis, the political space proper. And so this idea of freedom, of isonomy, depended upon a public space, the agora, a marketplace, or the polis, where people could act and speak and do things in public and matter. That's what it really means for Arendt. It's to matter. It's to be visible. It's to be recognized. And thus, she'll say on page 24, freedom is not the same as liberation. 22, 23, she says this liberation is simply being free from someone else's rule. But freedom, the idea of freedom, isonomy, is the idea of mattering, the idea of having your voice and your actions seen and heard so that people have to respond to them. And so on 24, she'll say, freedom includes, quote, speech making and decision taking, the oratory and the business, the thinking and the persuading, and the actual doing, which proved necessary to drive this claim to its logical conclusion, independent government and the foundation of a new body politic. Speech making, decision taking, oratory, and business. Freedom means acting in public so that people have to take account of you. That's the idea of freedom. And it's not connected to social equality per se, although you have to have enough, she thinks you have to have enough money or enough goods so that you can actually appear in public. And that public equality is what she's really after. And so she'll say on page 24, when you appear in public and you are able to be recognized, you have the experience of being free along with the idea of being free. And this experience of being free was a new experience. And so she writes on 24, what the revolutions brought to the fore was this experience of being free. So in the American and French revolutions, suddenly people acted and spoke and other people listened to them. And they were having an impact and they mattered. And this the idea of freedom now becomes an experience of freedom, and it was a new experience. And she continues, and this relatively new experience, new to those at any rate who made it, was at the same time the experience of man's faculty to begin something new. And this is the coincidence of the idea of freedom, which now becomes an experience of freedom, which is also the experience of starting something new. And it's only where, she writes on page 24, only where this pathos of novelty, of beginning something new, is present, and where novelty is connected with the idea of freedom, are we entitled to speak of revolution. Only where change occurs in the sense of a new beginning, where violence is used to constitute an altogether different form of government, to bring about the formation of a new body politic, where the liberation of oppression aims at least at the constitution of freedom, can we speak of revolution. So we need novelty, the pathos of novelty. And it needs to be connected to the idea of freedom. So it can't just be, we're going to start a new, thing. We can't just be like, we're totalitarian or we're Nazis or we're communists and we're going to start a new country based on radical economic equality. No, it has to be a pathos of newness, of novelty, connected to freedom, of each one of us having the capacity to act and speak and matter in the public world. So those are the first two sections of chapter one. Chapter one is divided into 5 sections. Those are the first two. They're really the core of this chapter, and it's this sense of her trying to give a sense of the spirit of revolution as the idea of freedom, the experience of freedom, and the experience of starting something new. In chapter 3, in section 3 of chapter 1, she asks, where do revolutions originate? Where does this begin, this idea? And she says it's modern, and she distinguishes it from some older ideas again. And she says the one pre-modern thinker who would have some claim to being the beginning of revolutionary thinking is Machiavelli. And the point of Machiavelli that's interesting to her, the reason that she calls him the spiritual father of revolution on page 27 is his insistence on violence. And so he'll write on pages 28 to 29, she'll write on pages 28 to 29, quote, Machiavelli's insistence on violence is more suggestive. It was the direct consequence of the twofold perplexity in which he found himself theoretically, and which later became the very practical perplexity besetting the men of the revolutions. The perplexity consisted in the task of foundation, the setting of a new beginning, which as such seemed to demand violence and violation, the repetition, as it were, of the old legendary crime. Romulus slew Remus, Cain slew Abel, at the beginning of all history. The task of foundation, moreover, was coupled with the task of law-giving, of devising and imposing upon men a new authority, which, however, had to be designed in such a way that it would fit and step into the shoes of the old absolute that derived from a God-given authority, thus superseding an earthly order whose ultimate sanction had been the commands of an omnipotent God and whose final source of legitimacy had been the notion of an incarnation of God on earth. And so here's what she finds important about Machiavelli as a thinker of revolution. It's the coincidence of violence with foundation. Foundation is going to become a key word for us because the foundation is the foundation of freedom. And how do you found a new government, a new world of freedom? Well, to a certain extent, you're going to have to wash away the old. You're going to have to create something new, and this is the experience of the new. And this is why she begins this chapter with the metaphor carried on from the introduction of the state of nature, an unbridgeable chasm, a pre-political world. And so, in a sense, the violence has to separate the two. And Machiavelli is willing to talk about violence as necessary for creating a new foundation that gives it a kind of authority because it's violent and comes out of a crime, in a way will be necessary for the establishment of freedom as opposed to simply it's not just the liberation, that's part of the violence, but you need a kind of cleansing and establishing, and violence is going to be important for that. And thus for Arendt on page 30, she's going to say that the truly new in revolutions, however, was not there for Machiavelli, and it only emerged in the modern age. And this truly new is that those who not only at present but throughout history, not only as individual but as members of a vast majority of mankind, the low and the poor, all those who had always lived in darkness and subjection to whatever powers there were should rise and become sovereigns of the land. That idea, that the poor and the low, and that all people are present and visible and have a potential to act and speak in public, that wasn't in Machiavelli. And so Machiavelli can't actually be called the founder and thinker of revolutions. Chapter 4, again, was to pursue this idea of the revolutionary spirit and novelty in revolutions. And it's section 4. And it's really about the fact that even the revolutionaries, especially in America, but in France as well, didn't start the revolution thinking they would start something new. It was more seeking and pursuing freedom. And as they experienced freedom, the idea of newness emerged. Section 5 is a bit more academic, and it's engaged with Hegel and Marx and the thinkers of the revolution as a scientifically necessary dialectical necessity idea. The idea that revolutions have a kind of irresistibleness to them. And Arendt worries that in saying such a thing, we remove freedom from the idea of revolution. And she is going to resist this idea of irresistibility. She says on page, and Hegel is the thinker of first thinker of history as man, as simply in some ways a plaything of a kind of spiritual history that is unfolding both in ideas and then in the world, and it's the coming together of world and idea, world and spirit for Hegel. And Marx, as I'm sure some of you know, saw politics as a kind of scientific necessity, the laws of which could be found, and that revolution would be the outcome of bourgeois society, bourgeois capitalism. But Arendt wants to resist this, and she thinks the American experience was quite opposite to that. Man, she says, in the American Revolution, was the master of his destiny. He wasn't simply the plaything of history. And on page 42 to 43, she writes, explains the importance of this, I think. Quote, theoretically, the most far-reaching consequence of the French Revolution was the birth of the modern concept of history in Hegel's philosophy. Politically, the fallacy of this new and typically modern philosophy is relatively simple. It consists in describing and understanding the whole realm of human action, not in terms of the actor and the agent, but from the standpoint of the spectator who watches a spectacle. And so when you think of politics from a historical point of view, you don't look at the actors, you sort of look at the story, and you look as a spectator and you tell the story, and you take away the freedom of the actors. They just are part of a unfolding historical story. It's important to note that Arendt thinks the spectator is deeply important in politics because all stories are told by spectators who watch them, and thus the spectators give them meaning to the stories, and that's deeply important. But the actors themselves still need to act, and actors are important too, and thus revolutions can't be seen as simply something irresistible, something happening according to laws. We have to actually attend to the freedom of the actors themselves. And so this is her argument in The Meaning of Revolution, that it's the coincidence of the idea of freedom, the experience of freedom, and then the experience of a new beginning. And it's these three things that, as she says on page 45, set the world on fire. And that's what we're going to be reading about as we continue to read the book. I look forward to speaking about On Revolution, Chapter 1. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you very much.